now available in paperback and ebook, The Man Who Rules the World. John Hayes must bring together men and gods to overcome a threat that seeks to destroy the planet. The Man Who Rules the World, now available in paperback and e-readers everywhere. In a previous video, I discussed how some of these Afro-American Negro women have been proposing the idea of divesting their economic resources from the black community. Now, when it comes down to some of these Afro-American Negro females, they are so caught up in their emotions about black men that they're not looking at the bigger picture of the overall black community. And many of these women in this small group believe that they're so educated and know so much that they think they know what divesting means. Now, when it comes down to these Negro women, primarily they get all their ideas about divesting from late 1980s discussions on South Africa and people talking about how major corporations should have divested their economic resources from South Africa because of the apartheid policies that were going on during the time in South Africa. So that's their frame of reference as regarding the whole divestment argument. And they believe that because they heard this back in the late 1980s talking about divestment, they can apply the same types of approaches to the black community. Now, this shows me that in spite of having an education at a college or a university, that many of these Afro-American Negro women, while they are educated, just aren't very smart. As a guy with a college degree in business and has studied economics, I can tell you that this Afro-American Negro woman cannot divest from the black community because she has not invested any sort of economic resources into the black community. Now, when it comes down to economic systems, an economic system is the way a nation allocates its resources. And the way resources are allocated in the black community literally prevent this Afro-American Negro woman from divesting from her own community. Now, back in the 1960s and the 1970s, in the early days, as the feminist movement was going on, we had economic resources in the black community. We had black-owned businesses, and we had black professionals in the black community. And because we had those black people in the community, we had resources. However, as black women joined up with the white females in the feminist movement and supported the white liberals' welfare state, resources began to leave the black community. Many of our professionals moved out of the black community, taking away resources from the black community, and many others wound up taking jobs as part of white corporate America. And other black women decided to join the roles of the welfare state, and others decided to take jobs as a part of the affirmative action programs that were established by the government. And as a result, you had all the resources taken out of the black community and none put in. So there was no investment in the black community by black people, and because there was no investment and resources were going out, there is nothing there. Most of the resources that your modern day black woman has come primarily from either the government or white corporate businesses. So there is no way your Afro-American Negro female can divest from her own community because over the last 50 years she has not invested a single dime into her own community. When we take a look at the Afro-American Negro community, we can clearly see that she has not invested any resources in her community because as someone who has lived in a place like the South Bronx for over 25 years, I have seen this happen firsthand because many of the black-owned businesses that were in shopping districts like 167th Street, which is not too far from me, many of those businesses wound up closing and Latinos wound up taking over some of the bodegas here in the South Bronx. Arabs took over some of the grocery stores and delis here in the South Bronx. Koreans took over the hair care market here in the South Bronx. And when it came down to fast food and franchise restaurants, they're primarily owned by Indians and Africans. And that means that no one in the black community controls any of the economic resources in the black community. And because no one in the black community controls any of the economic resources in the black community, which are the businesses or the infrastructure for many of those businesses, what happens is you cannot divest from something because you are not investing in anything. In order to be able to divest from a community, you have to be a producer. And when it comes down to the Afro-American Negro female, she is not a producer. She does not create businesses. She does not turn resources into products. She does not turn raw material into products. So she does not sell anything. In most cases, she is a consumer, and she spends her time buying everything from those Hispanic bodega owners, those Arab store owners, those Korean hair care and nail salons, those Indian fast food restaurants, those white supermarkets. Most 97% of her dollars go out of her pocket into non-black hands and white hands. So when we take a look at this Afro-American Negro female and her argument about divesting, it's a ridiculous argument once you deconstruct that argument based on economics. Because when it comes down to this Negro female, she does not own anything, and because she does not own anything, she cannot divest anything from a community she never invested anything in. And the last 3% of the dollar she does have, what she does is she gives that 3% to that black pastor, and because she gives it to that black pastor, then 100% of her dollars go out of her community, and that's why her community is the poorest place in the world. But the Afro-American Negro female will sit there and talk about how this black man is no good, this black man is trifling, and because this black man is no good and trifling, this is her reason for her saying that she needs to take her resources out of the black community and go elsewhere. Now, when it comes down to this part of the argument, this is where she really starts to fall apart. Because when we take a look at this Afro-American Negro female, this Afro-American Negro female sitting there talking about divesting, wants to talk about how this black man is no good and trifling, when 50 years ago, these same black females said that they were strong and independent and did not need a man, and that they could raise a boy to be a man. So many of these beta male Negroes you see in this community who are trifling and no good and sitting around terrorizing their own community or sitting up on their mother's sofas playing video games or bickering and arguing on the internet, they were raised primarily by this Afro-American Negro female who sat there and said she could raise a boy to be a man. Well, if she was supposed to have been able to raise this boy to be a man, you would think that this man would be able to go out here and do for self and take the resources that were around him and use them to build. But because he gained feminine life skills from this female, what happened is this beta male is expecting females to go out here and meet his needs and will not go out here and take the lead to meet his own needs and take care of his own community. And that's all because this Afro-American Negro female bought in to the false concepts of feminism, which told her that she could raise a boy to be a man. She did not need a man to help raise this boy to become a man. And because she did this, this boy never got the life skills he would need to go out here and be a man. So many of these trifling, dysfunctional Afro-American Negro males you see standing outside of an Arab-owned store at 6 o'clock in the morning to 11 o'clock at night when that Arab guy closes that store, many of those boys learned their way of life from her, and they learned how to be dysfunctional from her. So her sitting there talking about she's going to divest in order to get away from these men, that's not going to change anything, because when it comes down to this female, wherever she goes, she's going to bring that culture with her. And I made an example of this talking about how former YouTuber Dan Freeman talked about how life was going in Memphis about a decade ago. And he talked about this, and he said that they decided to bring some of these black females into Memphis and areas like the Graceland area and other middle class areas, and they quickly turned them into ghettos. And I noticed that here also in the South Bronx, that whenever you bring dysfunctional people into neighborhoods, they will bring those neighborhoods down, because when it comes down to these females, they do not know anything about economics. No matter how much education they have, their mindset is always focused on consumption and not production. And because they're always focused on consumption, they have no set of sense as related to building and maintaining standards. No, when it comes down to building and maintaining standards for a community, those are skills that only men have. And because the Afro-American Negro female doesn't understand these skills, because she is not a man, she will only think about buying Gucci handbags and designer clothes, rather than trying to teach her sons that this is their community and that they have to go out of their way to make an effort to maintain their community. Now, those are only skills another man can teach another man, because a man understands that this is a community he built, this is a community he built with his resources, and he has to make efforts to maintain that community if he hopes to have a certain quality of life. But because many of these females are used to getting their needs met by men, they could care less about the community, because they believe they can monkey branch and go to another community if things get bad enough. But what they do is they bring their culture of dysfunction with them, and then they bring that community down and bring their quality of life down. So when they sit there and talk about, again, divesting from the black community, all you're going to do is leave one community and then go to another to practice the same pattern of dysfunctional behaviors that you participated in, and practicing the same consumerism that you participated in. Because when it comes down to the Afro-American Negro female, she knows nothing about business, she knows nothing about economics, and because she doesn't know about these concepts and understand these concepts, she'll sit there and get in her feelings talking about divesting from a community, when you, in order to divest from a community, you have to invest in a community. And you invest in a community by owning and controlling resources in the community. This is something your Afro-American Negro female can't understand, because when it comes down to many of these females, again, they don't understand concepts, because they have selective hearing and they do things based on their feelings. And because they have selective hearing, they'll hear the term divest and then talk about how they're going to divest from a community where they have never really invested any resources in it for 50 years. And when they present this argument, what they do is they make themselves appear to be incredibly foolish, because when you sit there and talk about you're going to divest from a community with no resources that you own, you make yourself look like a complete idiot. Because, again, in order to divest resources means, one, you have to actually have resources you own in that community, and it has to mean you own resources that you control in that community. Moreover, it also means you have to have resources that have economic value and have built wealth in that community, and that there are resources there that people see that are in demand. And this is something your Afro-American Negro female does not understand about economics, is that when you have these beta male terrorists terrorizing your community, running out black-owned businesses and allowing foreign businesses to come into your community, what happens is you have no resources that have any value. And when others are controlling the job that you work at and the money that you get, you have no actual resources overall. All of your economic needs are primarily being met by some white person or some non-black person, And because that white person or non-black person is out here meeting your economic needs, you have nothing to invest at all. Again, divesting means you have hard, tangible assets that build wealth, and you can then sell those assets to someone else and then move on. Now, back in the 1960s and 1970s, as some of these Afro-American Negro savages were rioting and tearing up their own community, what happened was those black men who did own resources sold their resources and then divested from the community because the community became an untenable place. And those black people who own black-owned businesses, they divested. And a lot of them divested by the early 90s. And what happened was many of these areas wound up being controlled by your Arabs, your Indians, your Hispanics, and your Koreans, because many of these Afro-American Negroes, instead of working with the black men in their community who had black-owned businesses, decided they didn't want to work with those people. No, they wanted to get into the integration Kool-Aid, and they wanted to be just like white people, and that took resources out of the black community. And this Afro-American Negro female, when she sits here and talks about divesting from her community, you have to really look at her critically and see her for the race trader she truly is. Because when it comes down to any Afro-American Negro female who can sit there and talk about divesting from a community that is struggling to have resources and get access to resources, all you can call her is the sellout she actually is, because any female who will sit there and talk about abandoning a community of black people, this is a deeply troubled female, and this is a female you have to look behind your shoulder at, because this is the type of female who will take out a knife and stab you in the back in the hopes of getting favor and approval with whites and non-blacks. And this is the type of female who is definitely a handkerchief head overall, because this is the type of female who does not have loyalty to the black community, does not care about the black community, and it would go right along, just like those African chieftains who sold slaves to whites, and go out here and try to support white supremacy. Because when you take a look at this Afro-American Negro female talking about divestment, this is not a female who cares about our community or cares about the quality of life in the community. All they want to do, is be like these talented 10th Negroes, be these elite Negroes who wants to be above all others. And they believe if they divest, they will be at the top of the food chain. But this is the type of predator who is a bottom feeder and only looks to exploit the community for their own personal gain. And this is why you cannot trust any female who talks about divesting from the black community, because this female overall is a sellout and a race trader, and is someone that we really need to look out for, because we've had so many people divest from the black community, and what we really need are more people to make efforts to invest in the black community, try to establish a standard in the black community, and make efforts to rebuild the black community so that we can establish standards and create a moral position and values in the black community. Because one of the big problems with the people who talk about divesting from the black community is that they do not value the black community, they do not value being black, and they do not value the history of our black community. And these are the people we need to make efforts to put distance between ourselves from, because when it comes down to these race traders, we need to make every effort to call them out, hold them accountable, and then make efforts to excommunicate these people from our community so they can find out what happens when you divest from the black community, and when black people cut you off, who has your back. If you'd like to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to try some of my SJS Direct titles and support a black-owned business, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.